diagnosis of dyspraxia, or Developmental Coordination Disorder, shortly known as DCD? Well, it's quite a common condition. It's probably underdiagnosed in the population. And it's a difficulty with being able to process and plan out your gross and your fine motor. So dys means something's bad or it's difficult, and praxia is relating to an action. So dyspraxia is that you have difficulty with actions, that they're not very good. So it can affect your gross motor skills, but it can also your fine motor skills. So children may have difficulty with the aspects of PE and moving around the building, but they may also have difficulty with cutting, gluing, sticking, and using a pencil, and handwriting skills. So that's really important to have that knowledge, because you may have students in your class who have not been diagnosed, but who actually are having those sorts of difficulties. In terms of getting a diagnosis, this is often made through an occupational therapist or a physical therapist, but you also need to rule out any sort of underlying medical condition, something like cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, and other medical disorders that could be causing this. So you need to make sure that that's overruled before you make that diagnosis of dyspraxia. It is listed in the DSM-5, but it's actually listed as Developmental Coordination Disorder, not the common term of dyspraxia, but those words can be used interchangeably. So we think it affects 5 to 6% of the population, possibly more boys than girls, but again, it's underdiagnosed, so those figures aren't really accurate yet. And children have quite a lot of difficulty planning, and it has to, in order to get the diagnosis, it has to be significant, it has to be persistent, and it has to interfere with daily living. So it doesn't just impact school, it may impact their ability to tie shoelaces, do up a zip, to use a knife and fork, to be able to cut with a knife and fork, to be able to get the knife and fork from their plate to their mouth with actually all the food staying on the fork. So it actually has to impact daily living. Buttons are quite a common one. So they may need some things either to be physically taught or to be modified. Now for some students, their level of dyspraxia might be to a point that they actually need things just to be changed. It's too difficult to teach them how to do it. So for example, you may have a student who really can't do buttons. So what you might do is you can actually run a thread of Velcro down the back. You leave the buttons on the front so it looks like it's buttoned up, but you actually have Velcro just there to do that up. It might be that you don't use a belt. You may need to think about, if you can't use a knife and fork, how are you going to eat your dinner? What could you eat instead that doesn't involve using a knife and fork, particularly after school, eating dinner when the student may be really, really tired, and the last thing they need to do is to find some extra energy to do something which is really difficult for them to do. So working with an OT is a really good way to help look at what can be taught, but what then maybe just needs to be adapted that isn't possible to be taught. Students with dyspraxia benefit from visuals, empathy, working with them, knowing exactly how they help. Pre-teaching things is really useful. Using of the technology, there's so much technology out there. If you've got a student who finds it really difficult to use a pencil, there's speech to text, there's text to speech, there's write on the screen, there's learn to type. And for some of my students, actually, their typing now is so good that actually a pencil and pen would have been much slower anyway. And one of the other techniques that works really well when you're teaching students with dyspraxia how to learn a new skill is something called backwards chaining. So if you think about something, we have all the different steps that we use to work through. So what would happen is the adult working with the child would break down all the steps, show them all the steps, then they would do, say, steps 1, 2 and 3, and the child does the last one. And then the next time, the adult does 1 and 2 and the child does 3 and 4. So they learn the end of the task first, so they always get the success, and then they gradually work back so they can do the whole task. And that's a really useful strategy for helping teach lots of skills, because if you only ever learn the beginning and the adult finishes it, that doesn't really give you a sense of achievement. Whereas if you do backwards chaining, the adult starts, you finish. The adult does a little bit less, you finish a bit more. And you can eventually work to a point where you can do that yourself. So dyspraxia, or Developmental Coordination Disorder, is something that's in your classroom. There's probably a couple of children perhaps in each year level, once we actually have that clear level of how many children have that.